I am super excited to have Muhan Zhang with me, who is Yang 2020 employee number one and chief operating officer of that presidential campaign that we all loved. We're going to talk about that experience. What was Andrew Yang like as a manager and a leader? We're also going to talk about what Muhan's up to in terms of startup investing and sort of the next chapter in his career. And time permitting, we will hit on the Asian American experience and probably touch on some of the Stop AAPI hate stuff. But before we get into that, we got to warm it up with our very own former guests, and we'll start it with Andrew MF Yang.
Bang, dang, is and Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, is and Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! That's amazing.
Muhan, you are probably one of the few guests that recognizes most of those previous
Dude, that was
guests.
like the greatest, throwback ever. I was like, oh, wow. Boom, 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 boom. Amazing.
Yeah. I think, my favorite might be Kid Poker. And it was a shame that he came on and started doing stuff just as the campaign was kind of, winding down. But it was kind of an interesting collision of my worlds because I used to play poker recreationally.
Love it.
And would always sort of watch the pros and seeing Kid Poker on there was super cool. But welcome to the show, sir. How are you doing?
I have to tell you, it's such an honor to be here. I'm super, super excited. I obviously spent the last 3 to 4 years of my life repping someone else's brand and very, very, very proud of that work. Now that Yang is no longer an outsider, right? I was just watching the episode you did. He is clearly the front runner in the mayoral campaign. It's an immense amount of satisfaction. And even from like the policy standpoint, right? We just passed the stimulus that has the Child Care Provision Act into it. It's actually very funny to me that no mainstream media is like, I wonder where this proposal came from. Why are we so much more interested in talking about cash transfers? They're like, fine, Asian guy does the work. Andrew Yang does the work, gets it done, doesn't get credit. That's cool. He'll just be mayor of New York. That's not a bad, second place prize.
It's a little bit like the COO role sometimes too, probably.
I appreciate that. I have gotten confused for, it's charming, it's endearing, but I'm like, okay, people have called me the campaign manager, which I was not. That was Zach Grauman, excellent campaign manager. But much of my role was like the gritty things, right? Like I handled all the regulation, I handled all technology, I handled all finance, and then eventually built out teams to support those functions. So I understand that misnomer. I have gotten confused for Andrew Yang at the very beginning in 2017 to 18. There are some very cute and fun stories there. I actually, you and I are both Chinese American. I have one of my favorite photos of all time is this photo of me and Yang at this United Chinese Association event. And it's just like traditional Chinese all in the back. And Yang is like standing very stoic. And there I am, like, very intently trying to translate universal basic income automation tax and truckers into Mandarin, and that is like just, it's like my mind is like breaking because thank God I kind of spoken about those concepts to my mother in Mandarin, so I wasn't completely thrown off. But yeah, it was a very surreal experience.
So how did that start? I think I read that you were at Venture for America. Is that how you and what was the first interaction between you and Andrew?
Sure. It's pretty funny. I'll say this as a highlight for anyone who's like, that's a very weird, way to get a job, as I will explain. I will say that the headline is respond to mass emails individually, because the person who sends mass emails almost never gets responses. Even when I was COO and I was sending it to my entire org, like very few people would respond. But then when you respond, like me as the person, like, oh my God, someone read my email, proof of life, right? I'm not shouting into the void. And so Yang and my relationship is kind of like this. So he was, of course, founder of Venture for America. figurehead. And we had a series of experiences on the fellowship that got us in like proximity. So what that means is when new fellows came on at that time, we each got a 30-minute conversation with him. That was cool. At the time, he tried to discourage me from going to a startup that had missed payroll several times already. But I was like, isn't this the point of Venture for America, right? If I can figure out how to startup like, navigates this period of uncertain existential angst to potentially making it, that would actually be the point. That's like why I'm doing this fellowship. He's like, you're crazy, but cool. Go forth and prosper. I end up I get laid off 6 months after that. The business at that time did not have a solid business model. And so he actually calls me to say like, hey, I heard you lost your job, really friendly. And I was like, this is, thank you so much for calling. Like, how did you know? There's like hundreds of fellows. And I think at the time what it was he was on this large fundraising bend on the West Coast. And I think it was rejuvenating for him to reconnect with a lot of the fellows, like the people, right? Because begging rich people for money is soulless. And unfortunately, that is like all that job is when you're the candidate, when you're the founder. Like now I beg rich people for money on the internet for my investment analysis. So we had a little bit of that relationship. I got a new job. I was like, hey, just want to say, post an update, got a new job. Thank you so much for your support. It meant a lot to me. If you want, like I can CC you on a life update. We have this tradition in Venture for America among fellows to do like a 1-year update. So I updated him. And among those things, for those who don't know about Venture for America, but a lot of the goals are very aligned with Yang's kind of, they were the progenitor to Yang's campaign. This idea of we need to democratize economic growth, equality, and jobs in different American cities, right? And so one of the themes I wrote in my essay was like, hey, I have learned a lot about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship means that you can work on really innovative stuff with no business model and your business will fail. It's very brutal. Like for me, from a business and a computer science background, I'd always really bought into this mythos of make a great product and it'll sell itself. Not in now, right? As a startup investor 6 years later, this is not how this thing works, right? If you sell insurance, if you sell air, if you sell a brand, that is more times than less going to be a better product than like a really complicated technological innovation that people then don't know how to scale, right? That people don't. And I think you like very specifically understand, given your professional experience, the trade-offs between innovation, which creates value, and the capturing of value, which is like the marketplace standpoint. So from that standpoint, like working in VFA and doing all these things, I got it. I did get it. The second company I worked at was much more latter stage as a startup, providing English language learning online to Latin America, right? Like 130 million in venture capital, just very much providing a boring service that I could get behind, right? English language learning, lots of fun.
Right.
But when I joined that company, because they were free cash flow generating, we actually had a budget to then go do these innovative things. And that like blew my mind. And even the way that, my boss and leaders of the org talked about like buying innovation, building innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So I shared many of these things in this letter, being like, hey, I don't know how we're going to create more jobs in these cities. And like, I am now here and I'm like, oh, wow. Most of entrepreneurship is actually being conventional. It's not creating new things that the market is not willing to pay for. And so a lot of these kind of like heartfelt reflections, he sent that to the org. I guess I'll fast forward to 2016. On the backdrop, this is like 4 months after I wrote this letter to my class and to Yang, and Yang can forward it to the org. Donald Trump wins, right? Donald Trump wins in 2016. I think that is like a shock for much of the nation, and certainly among Venture for America fellows, generally like very idealistic, probably a little bit liberal leaning. The sense making apparatus is a little bit weak at that time. So Yang sends out this email to the entire organization, trying to encourage us to say like, hey, no matter how you felt about the election, whatever these things, like I lived through Gore versus Bush, right? What you do and the decisions you make in your day-to-day matter much more than like how you vote. Do both, but like know that you guys walking away from super prestigious, high-paying jobs and soulless corporations to try and actually have an impact. Your day-to-day, it makes us so proud at Venture for America. Like you're the best, and you are the hope that we put into the country. So again, this, I think, is to that very, very early anchor. I respond to this email. So we did have like emails back, but I respond to this email and I say like, hey, like, thank you so much. I gotta tell you, I think the Democratic Party in America just has its head up its ass. Like, how can we possibly talk about making society more equitable when we're not talking about hardcore economic like reflection and putting money into a variety of these things. At that point, I had no idea like universal basic income, but I think coming from a Chinese background, for better and for worse, my mind is very structured to think naturally to money and resources as the primary factor of change. And then everything else builds on top of that. And so from my experience in that realm, I share that to Yang. He responded, he's like, couldn't agree anymore. Keep your head up, do your best. Then fast forward to April 2017, he calls me while at work to tell me he's running for president and can I build his website? And so that's like how this all comes together. And so I moved to New York in September 2017, start building his website. You start the website and then you need a donate button, and then a donate button needs a bank, and the bank needs the financial regulation. So you fast forward to 2018, and I was the only person who knew how to actually do all three of these things, right? And so that's how I fell into the COO role.
Where did you move from? To
Miami, Florida.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You were in Miami.
I was from Boston to Miami and Miami to New York.
Oh, have you ever ventured to the West Coast?
I not for significant periods of time, but it is on my list. I'm so interested in that cultural experience. I think you West Coast Asians, I would love to learn from that heritage, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up on the East Coast most of my life, and then moved out here after grad school about 18 years ago. And it's interesting, like on the East Coast, you kind of think you're in the center of the universe because you've got New York, you've got Boston, like DC. And then you come out west and you're like, oh, this ain't so bad after all. Just the weather alone is huge. And then as an Asian American,
right?
I mean, when I moved out to Washington, to Seattle, our governor was a Chinese American dude.
Wow.
And I was like, that would not happen in New Jersey or Massachusetts or New York, at least back in the day. Probably would be difficult now. Yeah. And then a buddy of mine was living in San Francisco, and he was like, yeah, the mayor of San Francisco is a Bowdoin guy. He's an Asian dude.
Wow.
So those are things that you very rarely see in other parts of the country. And I think it's just a kind of a critical mass in terms of demographics, and maybe a little bit more openness to different cultures out here. But let's go back to you, Muhan. So you moved to New York.
Yep.
You set up the website. Was that an easy yes to help him? Because it's like, that's a low probability run. I mean, not only low probability that he will win, but low probability that anyone will even notice, and take the candidacy seriously. How did you process that one?
It is a great question, because I do think from the outside, many people immediately go to the likelihood argument. There was I checked in with my journals just to make sure I'm not, excessively contorting the past. So I was immediately interested and I wanted to do it. And more of my skepticism was not about the likelihood, but about, was he serious? Right? Like, this is a guy who was the founder of a nonprofit, like has employees, like by all standards, American or Chinese or whatever other standard you're coming from, like a legitimate dude. But in 2017, he is announced, right? He's like, I'm leaving my post, running for president on a universal basic income. Just like those three things together is like inconceivable. So it took me a few weeks, and I had to hash it out, right? I had to be like, wait, so is this a job? Do I get covered? Right? Like, well, what is the plan? Like, and then I mean, it was very like kind of due diligence on that side. In terms of whether from like an interest or from a standpoint, very much like most startups, when you're hiring your early stage employees, your employees are mostly missionaries, right? They're missionaries because, and I would say at that point for sure, I was motivated by like the missionary drive. So the reason being, like, example is the missionary versus the mercenary idea, right? The mercenaries are like very, very good at their jobs, but you could be selling Facebook ads for jewels and they don't really care, right? They're just like executing. Whereas the missionaries in that sense are more weirdos. I'm fairly aware I'm kind of a weird guy, but driven by that. So, put yourself into my shoes. I'm 24. I have a very particular worldview, and it's probably one that really aligns with your audience. And this guy who is an Asian American entrepreneur. Again, there's just not that many of them. At that time, like I couldn't name for you an Asian American CEO, really. Like maybe besides like Satya and like
Sundar?
yes, Sundar, exactly, for Google. But like an East Asian American CEO,
Yeah, East Asians much less. Yeah,
much less. And now I will say Eric Yuan seems to be killing it. I love Eric Yuan, like Shandong all the way. He's like very amazing. And you know, Ben Chestnut is like Hapa in Georgia. He runs MailChimp and owns the entire, you know, his 50% of the equity. So there are these examples. But at that time, it's like in my direct circle, I do not know an East Asian American male CEO who seems to be like working on something that he cares about, right? Like, sure, if you give me, you know, some SVP at Goldman, fine. But like, do I look up to this guy? No, absolutely not. You're just a expensive cog. And so, so this guy that you really respect, and I've read his books at this point, Smart People Should Build Next America. And then later on, I read a dozen versions of the War Novel before that thing went to get published. So this guy you really admire, who seems like a unicorn in many ways, you're like, huh, there's just not a lot of use. Tells you he's about to do this incredibly ambitious thing that like intellectually completely matches your worldview, right? I just from another standpoint, this is not surprising because later on we found that unfortunately, for better and for worse, who supports whom in the presidential campaigns is mostly a demographic thing. So we drew like all the young Asian men who worked in STEM. Like this is not, you know, I'm not an anomaly. This is also why like college educated women tend to disproportionately go for Elizabeth Warren. It's like, you know, that's it, that is the reality of our politics, and the amount of people who actually then take a critical position and switch. I think like Bloomberg's campaign research this, it's like 6%. It's really embarrassingly low. Yeah, we've talked about this with some Yang alums who, you know, have had their distributed experience in different political arenas. So yeah, so in my position, 24 years old, have a very specific worldview, someone who appears to be totally credible is about to do this radical thing that is completely in line with your worldview. I mean, really, there was not, this was not a, oh, do I want to risk my career to do this thing? It was like, a holy crap, I can't believe that this is a real thing. Like, are you for real? Are we actually going to do this? Or is this just you kind of like, and you know, even in terms of comparables, one of the comparables we had was Larry Lessig, right? Larry Lessig had done the Mayday PAC back in I think the mid 2000s, raised a serious amount of money. Super idealistic guy, went nowhere.
Yeah, I gave some money to him.
Thank you. No, great guy, right? And he's like, I think I've like been to his house in Boston. Like he's like a really, really good guy. And this is one of those things that I now regularly identify as a pattern as a startup investor, which is that nerds are fantastic. But if nerds don't learn to be CEOs, they generally don't become good CEOs, right? They are so product focused. They're not really focusing on the marketing side of it. And unfortunately, when you're at a startup, 50% is building, of course. But like, you know, just even now going to my business, I got my first customer without having a product. I just asked, I was like, wait, I'm in media. I just haven't monetized. The topics I'm covering are very lucrative because literally these startups are running ads to get people to invest in their equity crowdfunding campaigns. And so I didn't have a product. I just said, hey, would you guys like pay for a premium newsletter without really having it? And then like I drafted something, but it wasn't anything good. And I got my first customer. And that is like such a different way of thinking, right? I think one of the reasons people like my investment analysis is very systemic, right? I was COO. And what that means is like I run things, not like personally, but like I build and I design and I, you know, empower other people's systems to run these systems. Like everything's a system to me. Very few of these things are, you know, that remarkable from an individual standpoint. And so, sorry, I got a little bit excited there. But so to bring it back to this idea of like, was I really excited to work for him? Of course. But generally speaking, just really could not believe that this was something that I would happen into so early. But then I, you know, in terms of one of the dark comments or jokes I also say is I do think Donald Trump's election in 2016 woke up the complacent elite of America in a significant way, if that makes any sense. And I think you even see it in, you know, I understand like coronavirus, COVID, it's exceptional times, but just from like a layman's point of view, I'm like, wow, Biden seems to be like really cruising in his first 100 days, like just just like very, very warp speed and very, in many ways aggressive, good aggressive, but kind of like in a way that feels like a wartime CEO rather than a peacetime CEO, if that comparison that lands.
Yeah. And what did your parents say when you said, "Hey, I finally found a startup that's got traction, but I'm gonna leave and I'm gonna work for this dude that's gonna run for president of the United States"?
Oh man. Well, so my parents are separated. And so I think that actually helps in that my father was like, like it's like you only have like one parent that you have to really justify it to. And when I moved to Miami, I mean, I love my mom, but my mom's like image of Miami was like 1990s. She's like, oh, are there gonna be drugs there? Is there gonna be like a
Oh,
lot
like
of
Miami
violence
Vice.
there?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly,
Crockett and Tubbs.
You got it. So I think she was like excited I was moving to New York, right, closer to Boston, my hometown. And I think at that point I had already fronted a lot of that kind of like cultural resistance when I decided to do Venture for America. I'm very open. My first job paid me $38,000 as a college grad who had studied business and computer science. Like I was far under earning what I think the expectations were. And really what it came to me was like how I made that decision back in college was at the time I did not know what I wanted to do. However, the seeds of what I knew motivated me were autonomy. I wanted to be able to work on what I want, where I want, when I want. And specifically, like at that time, I was really interested in coding all these like weird apps and trying to figure out how to make them make money. So now kind of in retrospect, I'm like, okay. And so entrepreneurship to me was the only way to figure out how to make these things you care about also provide a living. And that theme is even like what I go back to now in my writing as a startup investor, right? Founders are, for better or for worse, people who get capital and can, run payroll to pursue some kind of a calling that they believe is worthwhile and can be actualized. And in that sense, they're a very, very small percentage of the population if you look at people who actually feel engaged with their work, right?
Yeah. Well, so now let's fast forward. You moved to New York, and you're kind of in this still in this entrepreneurial track in many ways. How long were you in that kind of valley of despair before the Rogan?
Oh my gosh.
The Rogan moment.
I love this. I've written a few pieces on the campaign, so your question is perfect because I know this quite well. Summer of 2018, right after Sam Harris. So we went on Harris in June and we made about 60,000 in month that 1 month. Then from there, the entire second half of 2018 was the valley of despair, all the way up until March of 2019. It was about 9 months. I remember maybe in November or December, I mean, I was truly miserable. And reasons I was miserable was because I personally, like now in retrospect, I can place it into context, but put this into perspective, right? I was a quarter CTO, a quarter CFO, a quarter CLO in terms of chief legal officer, and still having to be the COO. So what that meant is my day-to-day was like I would switch between having to figure out the integration between our website to our CRM to doing typing to like process all the regulatory information we need on the contributions, because people are like giving us these monies in envelopes and you have to like have that stuff ready for the, and I am the one who filed some of our early FEC reports, despite never having done this. And like generally you pay now, later on I hired a firm for it, but like the firm took 1% of our filing, like of our revenue to go do that. 1%, right? We raised 3 million. Like that's a large budget. And I just like eat that. And so of course my work was not great, but I was just so under-resourced. And then also, like, I was the only one who knew how to get all the credit cards. I was the only one who knew how to get into our bank account. I was the only one who saw our burn. I was the one who paid our rent. Like I was one of the few people, not the only, for sure not the only, but I was one of the few people whose everyday constant tasks and work brought me to this like existential look at what our org was doing. And so I remember kind of just like one anecdote to demonstrate this. I think it was November or December. I got so excited because I went to Yang. I was like, hey, I figured out I can put our rent on our credit card. And it's like a 3% processing fee or something like that. And it was just like, great, this will get us more cash, right? This will just get us more cash. I mean, that, so like, to put that into perspective, my role put me into a position where I saw all those dots. And I was like, okay, how do we minimize cash burn? How do we And I will say, unfortunately, I actually think that I had that mindset of survival, which I think is very common among certainly immigrants, certainly Asian immigrants, was really useful during that time. Those mindsets held me back later when we start to scale. right? Surviving and thriving are two completely different mindsets. I think Yang talked about all the time on the campaign between scarcity and abundance mindset. But at that time, in many ways, that was what so much of my upbringing and life experience was really built for. Like, survive at all costs. Do not run out of cash.
A lot of times in startups, there are points where you almost hang up the towel and just say, this is not working. We're not getting market fit. What are we doing here, kind of
Correct.
thing. Did you ever get to that point, or was it always like, we'll just find a way?
So it's a very good question. There's two comments I have in response to that. So one is this. By 2019, I started joking, where I was like, people told us every reason why we wouldn't make it. He's Asian, no political experience. Democrats aren't going to let him get the nomination. Just like just so much mediocre excuses. I also joke. I'm sorry, sounds a little bit, obnoxious, but on a presidential campaign, especially when we were working events, so much of my life was people who had zero political experience telling me how to win the office of President of the United States. Now, as an entrepreneur, I have a lot of people who have never run a business who tell me how to run my business. So it's really funny because that's kind of a cruel way to say it. Let me put it a little bit more positive. These people want to help. They want to feel a part of something, right? And I get that. But very much, I did have to train myself to realize, like, wow, no one knows what they're talking about. As it turns out, there's only two reasons that your campaign will stop, right? One, you run out of money. Two, your candidate decides to stop running. Those are the only two factors that actually kill a campaign. Everything else is garbage and noise. And now, with the hindsight of 2021, we can totally see that's true. And for, I think in startups, the correlate is exactly the same. You run out of money, and then you have no resources. You can't do it. The people are calling in on your obligations. Or two, your founder runs out of vision for what the startup wants to do. They don't see a way out, then they return the money to the capital. I'll even say this, like, again, now on 2021, with the luck of hindsight, I found that actually, as long as the candidate in a political campaign or the founder of a startup still has the love, where they still have the faith, they can just raise more money. So even cash flow is like, something you would think is so concrete is actually just a qualitative thing. And so to your question of like, did we have that idea? Very much in my mind was like, okay, all these people, useless people, never done anything, completely complacent, and I'll say this one thing that really angers me is that my work experience at that point really did bring me into the social circles of some very wealthy people. And the complacency of the rich, who you would think are like, superheroes or like whatever, like you expect more of them because to whom much is given, like much is expected, really infuriated me in many ways. Very, very, very much infuriated in many ways. Like, wow, you guys are completely mediocre. I have no idea why we're begging you for money. You're just going to let this country kind of like rot because you're useless. It's a very like deep sentiment and anger, I think, that even kind of comes back every once. So there's that portion of it, and then the other portion of it really was, again, I had this incredible alignment with the org where I knew we were on the right side of history, right? So even if you don't want to talk about automation and technology, I remember having some doubts about universal basic income at the beginning, but then Yang is very good at making arguments, so certainly I was convinced. But I think, especially as someone who's now 28, at that time 24, I don't know a single young person who can really sincerely say like, ooh, we feel really confident about the future. Every trend is like bad. Healthcare gets more expensive. No one's going to be able to afford college. Housing costs are like ballooning through the roof. Incomes are not rising. Like, and so to say that all these problems were happening, and then one of the subjective experiences I share is, again, with other of my peers, the entire 2010 to 2020 experience for the most part felt like fake growth. Like, I grew up, I was in high school when the financial crisis happened. 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. Even when I came out in 2015, no one's like, oh, this is a great job market. That was 7 years after the financial crisis, right? Because what happened was like the jobs went away and many of them just never came back. It was not like a hiccup and then you go back to the normal American narrative of continued growth. It was very much like, no, those jobs went away and we found out technology actually can help those things. So I think certainly my personal worldview and confidence in that and what I had seen fed further my confidence that as long as Yang didn't, lose the faith and say, we're what's the word, shutting down the shop.
Mm-hmm.
The way I very much saw it was, as long as Yang keeps the faith, I'm going to make sure we don't run out of cash. That was like, those were the only two things to me that mattered. Everything else was garbage.
So tell me about the decision to suspend. A lot of us were really disappointed in that decision because I think a lot of us who invested felt like, okay, this is a founder that's going to go all the way until the countdown clock goes to 0.
Yeah.
And it felt like, oh, wait a minute, we're at halftime and they're not coming back on the field. I know it was a hard decision and the team put in a ton of work. How did that come about?
It's very, very excited to revisit this with you. I mean, it's not a happy time. It was a very sentimental time to help you orient to where to help you orient where my mind was when I heard the decision. I was in Iowa with 2 of my colleagues, and we were getting ready to shut down Iowa post whatever the caucus results were.
Right.
I was in, I think, Jasper County, caucusing. I did not caucus myself, but I was a precinct captain or whatever the term was, and I actually got 1 delegate in my. I was super stoked. So we tied with Steyer, we tied with Biden, we turned with Bernie, and I was like, wow, the magic of democracy working, obviously in my favor as well, was electrifying. It was truly electrifying. The decision, I think, came down to when we looked at what happened in Iowa. We had spent a massive amount of resources in Iowa.
Yeah.
I mean, the joke I also share with other friends is like, the first time that we had a campaign credit card statement with $10,000 on it for Facebook ads, I was like, oh my God, that is like many, many, many months of my living, right? Like, oh my gosh, I would never have a credit card bill that high. And also at that time, we actually ran a balance, which is also highly, right? No, but because there's no financing. There's no, you have no hard assets in the campaign. It's in many ways identical to a startup, except startups can at least get venture capital. On a political campaign, you are a cash-based, essentially, right? A cash-based, maybe you have some forecastable revenue through recurring donations, but mostly a cash-based business. And then so that was like the first time I was like, oh. And then the second time was, I remember I cut a check for $1 million for a TV wire ad. And I was like, oh my gosh. And this is like, within a year of each other. And then finally, when we get to this level where we're deploying TV, I mean, my team and I, the best team, like, they are the best team in the world. Like, we would have these war room scenarios where we'd be like, okay, we need to have this, $2 million, $3 million go out to TV that, like, beg that vendor, get like a discount on that vendor. Like, we have to make sure we don't run out of cash for the TV. So to say that, like, that had already been happening, and we had invested all those resources. And I think publicly everyone can see that Iowa did not deliver the return on investment, right? I think the idea was, okay, we invested a great deal into Iowa. Was there an opportunity where, and to elaborate on that more, this is completely my read, by the way, right? Not affiliated with Andrew Yang, not on the mayoral campaign, purely just from my direct experience here working, and based off of like FEC public filings. So that we had invested all this money and we really spent it on the field. We really had needed to demonstrate our legitimacy as a candidate in Iowa, and it didn't happen. And that I think after that, we could have still run. I mean, again, so much as you can tell that I was doing my job, we never ran out of money. We could have still run. But I think that was going back to what I say about the 2 things that actually cause you to lose or cause you to stop. I think at that point was when the candidate said, like, okay, like, as a personal person, I don't think he saw the path anymore. Yeah, I know. Yeah,
I mean, it does feel a little bit like a startup that had a lot of energy behind it. It launches its first version and it kind of, deeply disappoints.
Yeah.
But my natural intuition would be like, okay, let's figure out what didn't work.
Yep.
And let's get ready for V1.5 and give it another go until we all think there's just nothing here at all, and we got it completely wrong.
Right.
Because the fundamentals of the kind of policy and the strategy seemed so innovative and fresh, and it was generating a lot of energy. You know, I've seen startups that struggle for a while, and then it's also a timing game, and it's a who can survive game.
Exactly.
And, you know, they all dropped. A lot of the other folks dropped out right before Super Tuesday. Do you ever wonder what would have happened had Yang just stuck it out like another 3 months?
I think about that all the time because you want to know what was the divine timing. I mean, my last day on the campaign in terms of helping it shut down was, I think, like March 13th or 14th. It was that Friday. And I went into lockdown in New York City on the 16th. Yeah. Cash transfer looks a lot better when your economy is completely frozen.
Yeah.
And the marginalized are disproportionately being exposed to the disease, losing their jobs, being forced to, I mean, truly, like what you were saying about timing, I do think about that all the time. You know, I'm not the candidate. I know that like people, I know that de facto in the market I oftentimes look like a poor man's Andrew Yang. But I think it's a deeply personal decision.
Yeah.
And even if, you know, the guy's very smart, still think he's very smart. He's by all measures on track to be mayor of New York. And also he's just young. I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but like he's got decades left in him. And so to say that, could I see that he was playing a game? Like, you know, if to say I was thinking in checkers, like, hey, you have to win this one, but he was thinking in chess, which is like, yo, if I like waste all these resources and then, you know, completely burn out instead of gracefully exiting while I still have like the strong win and I don't have too much hatred of the Democratic Party. You know, again, I cannot speak for that, but putting myself into that position, I am very, I am famous. I don't know famous, but I have been publicly cited as saying that I did not think Yang would run for New York because I thought that that would not be the most efficient way to deploy universal basic income at a nationwide scale. And if you read The War on Normal People, even he says like, we can't really do this just on a local area, because if we do it on a local area, then all the people just flood to that area and then the system will not be able to actually sustain itself. And so I think his campaign now actually has cash transfers for the 600,000 poorest of New York. But to say that even in this idea of 2021, cash checks have gone out. Like I have already received, right, the IRS, whatever have you, and that families are going to start receiving this recurring check. Like actually that mission was accomplished, right? It wasn't Yang who did it. He was never, he incredibly consistently, he was never one to need the spotlight and the credit. So much so, like, here's like a fun fact. I don't know if you were this early on the campaign, Tom. Back at the beginning of the campaign, Yang asked me what we should name the campaign. The idea was like, would we name it Yang 2020, which we ultimately went with, or at the time it was UBI 2020, Universal. Yeah, truly like Larry Lessig with the made age, like just like wasn't about the guy. And I actually encouraged him. I was like, you know, it's true. Like, I don't think you're one for the spotlight. I think we should do this like universal basic income because like people will rally behind the idea, right? Thankfully, then, you know, we got it. So for like a month to 2 months, we had ubi2020.org as our website. Like I have screenshots of this being our website, and then thankfully, like, you know, we brought other members in and more marketing members were like, we can't separate these two brands. People aren't going to buy into an idea. They buy into the person behind, you know, who is wrapping the idea. And so we eliminated the UBI 2020. But so much as you can even see it in our early FEC filings. Sorry for the siren.
No worries.
In the early paperwork at ubi2020.org is our website. And so like that is who that man is. And I like understand, I think, you know, I have evidence to prove that is the way that his brain thinks. And so he's running for New York. He's going to do really, really well. And do I think that will give him a platform to prove even more of his innovative ways of solving policy? Yeah, for sure. And in many ways, that is why I like hold this faith where I'm like, you know what, he has skin in the game, right? This is literally his career. To me, like I can speculate, but what goes on in the head of Andrew Yang, only Andrew Yang can tell you through the behaviors, but I've certainly seen the man up close in many ways.
Yeah, and I should say, like, as bummed as I was that the campaign suspended, I gotta acknowledge that this guy basically put his life on hold for this campaign. He's a father, he's a husband. There are massive sacrifices, and so, you know, hats off to Andrew for everything he did in the presidential. On the mayoral race, did you consider joining the band or getting back together, or how did that? What was that like?
I think it was a friendly, mutual departure.
Mm,
I think it would have been this thing where, again, if you will entertain my uh, navel gazing mid 20 something year old, professional lens. So
mm-hmm,
I'm 27. I just went on this wild ride, right? Like at 24, I joined this dude. At 27, I come out, and I have helped play my portion in running a $40 million insurgent subversive presidential campaign that competed at the highest levels.
mm-hmm,
That's pretty weird. It's pretty weird. It's pretty wild. It's like very like, oh Jesus. And so I think if there was like a really acute need, and what that means is like I had run operations at a scale of a $40 million startup. That's like the way that I
mm-hmm,
conceive of that in kind of non-political startup terms. So is this mayoral campaign a big deal? Sure. Is it going to get to $40 million? Is it going to be like the same thing? No, not really. So do
mm-hmm,
you need the same skill sets even that I bring in that? Is this going to be as long term of a project? One of the things that most people also don't realize is, I mean, I worked on a presidential campaign for 3 years. Most political operatives maybe work on one campaign for 8 months.
mm,
The amount of longevity and the amount of it's like this. In many ways, when I talk about campaigns and startups, campaigns are like the startups of startups and worse, because in a startup, you can miss your quarterly goals. It's not great, but then you can
mm-hmm,
just make up for it on the later quarter. If you don't go, if you don't go public in year 3, you can go public in year 5, right? It's like the deadline can move. In politics, you do not have that. This is right. This is the primary deadline. This is the election deadline. That's it. And then you have the money problem, and then you have the talent problem, right? Like what type of
mm-hmm,
person can long term build their career in like such a non-sustainable fashion, right? There's a reason why politics, for better and for worse, has a lot of young people, including myself. I'm not losing that,
mm-hmm,
because young people are less encumbered by like normal people responsibilities, right? Mortgage, house, spouse, children,
mm-hmm,
whatever have you. So for me professionally, when I was looking at that, I didn't feel, and I will say, I mean, at that point, the mayoral campaign had not been announced. That was purely humanity forward. That was
mm-hmm,
what the movement was about, and I could see it. I could say like, okay, I could see myself doing this, but
mm-hmm,
certainly it's. I hope this feels okay to say. Humanity Forward's mission was not as nearly as clearly I identified as the
mm-hmm,
presidential campaign. So there's more ambiguity there. There's like that less clear like what winning looks like. At this point, I had already, I was no longer the 24-year-old self who had the startup experience and like clearly had, if I may, talent in executing things. Now at this point, like I've proven I can do some like pretty substantial things at scale.
mm-hmm,
And so even for myself, when I was thinking about like what things I liked and what things I didn't like, later on, and I wrote a piece about this, about how I transitioned from politics to now media. Very much, I do think secretly now, in retrospect, I think Yang and Grauman both accurately assessed that I was hungry to run a ship, even though I don't think I had the confidence to say that at that point, right? Because it felt too early. It felt too
mm-hmm,
early. But then I think once I really came down to it, and now that I have a business, now that I have customers, now that kind of I'm on the other side, I'm like, oh wow, that was exactly what needed to happen. I mean, my mother, mothers, love my mom, will ask like, oh, do you miss being on the mayoral campaign? And in all seriousness, no, not at all. I'm very happy for them, but I know the campaign life. You have to deal with like hit pieces. You have to deal with like
mm-hmm,
finance and fundraising. You have tons of, it's an organization. It's a machine. So you have all the traditional limitations of a machine as well. The types of people we hired on Yang 2020, when it was like me and the early 4 people, were very categorically different than the people who are 25, then 50, then 75, then 100, right? Just
mm-hmm,
the missionaries become increasingly more the mercenaries because now you have traction. And that changes the culture of an organization for sure. One of the things I mentioned earlier that I certainly would hope to be better at in my future careers, but I totally hired too late, right? Like I was still a one-man shop, if you want to put this into perspective, till August of 2019.
mm.
Yeah. Joe Rogan made the money in March, but again, like
Yeah.
I'm naming that because I know why I did that, because my cultural background and the way I've been like geared was survival at all costs. Do not increase your burn needlessly. Whereas like, I think many of my colleagues from a different cultural background were much more comfortable hiring people when we really didn't have that much money. And like in a way that comes from a background where they're more comfortable with having resources or just used to having more resources, right? The campaign was probably like the kind of like the most low income organization, so to speak, most scrappy organization they had ever worked for. Whereas like the campaign was quite wealthy from the types of organizations that I was used to, and certainly my family background. So to say that now that I'm on the other side, I mean, my job, I have colleagues all over the world. They pay me to work with me. Our job in terms of what our organization's KPI is to have the highest IRR, find the best investments, and then really build this culture decentralized, asynchronous. Like we don't even have to have meetings, right? To become the best investors, source the best deals, and then very much so how much you put in, whether it's from a time standpoint or a resource standpoint or literally a capital standpoint, ends up reflecting itself in your returns. Like that to me is what I am doing right now. But at the most surface level, it's a newsletter, but actually kind of like more deeper beneath it is this I think my business is very much a 2021 creator economy amalgamation now, if that makes any sense. So
yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about your next chapter. So tell us about this business, why you ended up doing it and what it's all about.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. So I left Yang, and that was in March. And I took a few weeks to veg out because COVID and all these things. And I started doing these exercises and really trying to articulate what I want to do. So to give you, I guess, like the largest punchlines, being COO is great. You're still full-time running someone else's ship. That's what it means. That's cool. It's incredibly privileged to have that position. But I don't think anyone has the dream where they're like, oh, I just want to run someone else's ship for the rest of my life, right? If you get to that point where you're like, oh, I'm competent. So I think that the most logical decision for me, when the most obvious decision would have been if I had left Yang and kind of embarked on a traditional career, would have been to start a venture-backed startup company. That would have been the most, and actually to make this even more real for you, I knew exactly what I would have built. I would have built an automated budgeting software app for Democratic campaigns because I paid $600 a month for the software that was essentially a glorified Google spreadsheet. It was totally manual. It had really pretty charts, really pretty graphs, and my non-technical colleagues loved it, which is why we ended up signing it. But to me, I looked at the software, I looked at what we were paying, and I thought like, why is this not like Mint.com? Why are you not using a Plaid integration to freaking pull in my cash on hand from my Citibank, right? Like all these things that we're used to in the consumer space, like we didn't have that in Democratic space. And then really, I mean, the possibilities there are quite large. You could even then start to do some innovative stuff like scraping FEC reports. So let's say you're a first-time subversive, anti-institutional candidate running in some district, and you don't have access or the money to high-end political consultants. If you were to use the software theoretically that me and my team would build, then we would be able to say, hey, you are, call it 120 days out from your general election. We have scraped the FEC reports of these other similar candidates in these regions, call it by Republican, Democratic spending, whatever. And they have spent at this point in your life cycle, call it like 10% of their budget on TV advertisements. Does that mean you have to do it? No. But like, is that a good thing to know for someone to help them become a campaign manager and like to have the wisdom of that aggregated knowledge? For sure. So this to me, like, would this be $1 billion business? No. But like, could that be a bootstrapped recurring revenue software business that very much I could sell? Most importantly, like now I'm on the other side. I'm like, oh yeah, I was a CEO of Yang. I could totally sell that product very, very comfortably. But I think looking at that plan, I was just not excited, right? I had just spent 3 years in politics. I was super, super burned out. There are amazing people in politics, but there's a reason why politics does not have longevity, and it's because of the really complex incentives in that workplace, right? Think about it. Like it's, yeah. So I can talk more about that, but I want to be mindful of time. So I explored what it was that got me excited, and I came to this conclusion that I was really excited about ideas. Like when I looked at my behaviors and what got me most excited, fun times. I remembered like translating Yang's ideas into Mandarin at that event, where I was like, wow, that's like a very specific thing that I can do, right? I read a lot, but like so do many people. But even the speed and the aggression and like a very, very I've noticed even watching recordings and more interviews of myself now as I gather them that my thoughts are very much actively shaped by quite a long like reading and learning habit, I suppose. And then finally, this idea of like combining and mixing different things together was also a pattern I noticed. So I figured out that I want to be in media, kind of, be you. But I had no idea what that meant. And then fast forward to August, I realized that I was in media through my blog. While I had been working at Yang, I had been replicating what I did in my professional life as a startup kind of guy. In my personal life, I was like, let me dual learn this, right? I'm going to set up my own website. I'm going to set up my own funnel. I don't have a product yet, but like I can try and figure out how to, if I experiment with building an audience outside of my work, I think this will only make me a better entrepreneur, right? And my brain certainly has always thought that way. So in August, kind of realized that, oh, wow, this like topic that I've been writing about, startups and investments, has really been, has a market, right? People pay for that, right? So I monetized from there. And then from there, that was August. I said to myself, okay, if I can get to 10 by October, that would be like 1 subscriber a week, sustained growth and like forecastable. And I hit that goal, like October 31st, I like just hit it. I was like, huh, interesting. I still had more imposter syndrome, more doubt at that point. So I was like, you know what, let me see if I can do it again, do it to 20. Let me see if I can do 20 by the end of December. Missed that goal by 2 weeks. So I hit 20 by mid-January. But I think really after getting to 20, both myself and my family and my friends were like, oh, okay. It's who knows if this is a massive, massive market, but like you have the legs, like there's 13 million accredited investors in America, just to like put that number in your head. If I have 1,000 subscribers, that is like a very, it's still work. I still have to work, but it's like a very comfortable living. And I think just like all these things really piece together. I'll say this, I'm happy to talk more about it, but one of the things I want to share with your audience very specifically that gets me very excited is this, Tom. Love Andrew Yang, great guy. I think the point of Andrew Yang is often lost on people, which is that it shouldn't be about him. He should not be exceptional. He should be the rule. If democracy relies on competent people with unorthodox ideas to like compete in the battle place of ideas, then there should be many more of him. Does that sound right?
There should be.
Cool. So why are there not more Andrew Yangs? Why are we pinning our hopes on this one dude?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Why do you think there aren't more of them?
Yes. And so that to me is the learned helplessness that the elite American class, whether we like to talk about it or not, but like the elites of America have totally internalized this learned helplessness from our institutions. Almost every institution in America at this point is like broken. Or it's certainly suboptimal. And I think those who got excited about Yang's campaign was like, we could just talk honestly about it, right? Do we actually trust that our colleges are delivering the education of like, their price tag? Of course not. No, it's totally bureaucrats, right? Do we actually trust that the medical healthcare system is really optimizing for our health outcomes? No, of course not. It's all activity based, right? It's the institutional failure is just up and down, corrupt and rotten to its core at this point. And unfortunately, like those who would be in the position to fix it have been taught like, oh, you don't have enough. This is like a deeply, deeply personal question to me. And this to me is like what excites me so much about my work. On the surface, I am a like young, unproven venture capitalist dude who runs a digital rich club, a digital club for rich people, right? My readers are very affluent, like 2/3 of them are accredited. They can make investments to highly speculative alternative investments, and they're insanely sharp. I mean, Yang's campaign gave me an experience to thinking about money as capital, but my readers like truly move large sums of money into new things in a way that like makes me have to pause and take a breath. So to this idea where it's like, oh, interesting, like you feel really comfortable doing these things, but like, why don't you feel good enough to run your own business yet, or to like pursue that passion of yours? And it's interesting because we have this on the fundraising for Yang too, this idea of not having enough. I've gotten to the stage in my life, it's started to inform some of my writing, where I have friends who are like under age 30 who will say to me like, oh, $250,000 is not that much money. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, you realize the median net worth of the American under age 35 is $10,000. The average is about $70,000 or $80,000. And you, my friend, like again, like friends, there's all kind of like in private conversation, are telling me that you have like $250,000 in the markets. And it's through some combination of savings, work, privilege, family, GameStop, crypto. Like there's so many. Like I am no longer surprised when these conversations happen offline. But then when you ask them, like, oh, about that dissatisfaction you have in your work or that dissatisfaction you have in society, you don't think that your resources could do something about that? And that's terrifying to me, because one of the big things I really now internalize is when I was reading Yang's work as a early 20-something, mid 20-something dude, I very much like that spoke to my soul. It totally spoke to my soul. And I thought that was meant for us. Like, and now I realize he was actually writing for his colleagues in their mid 40s, right? Like I'm talking about $250,000. I understand. No, Tom, you're super competent, but you know, you guys get much more money, tons more competence. And you like at this point have no excuse. I hope I'm not, putting anyone, but you understand the game, right? You understand the game. And so for you, right, you have your job, very, very competent. You're delivering products at the highest level. But then outside of your job, you are also running this channel and doing these things and connecting and really pushing this. Like you can feel very good about spending your time living your values in a way that I suspect, and this horrifies me, most of my peers cannot say that. I'll ask you, can you tell me with a straight face that the majority of your friends are living some version of their dreams?
Can I say they're living some version of their dreams? Yeah, I think actually I could say that they are living some version of their dreams. I mean, nobody's doing exactly what they wanted to do when they were little, but a lot of them are doing great work. And I think the thing for me, the insight that I would agree with you on is outside of their professional dreams, are they giving back as much as they could to the common good? Are they making investments, financial or time or otherwise for their community? Maybe not as much.
Right.
And that is disappointing. But I think in some ways that's why I've been doing, keeping this channel going and then starting Of the People, is because I kind of was like, well, shit, if Andrew Yang can put his whole life on pause,
yes,
and run for all these offices, like I can build a website on the side, I can do some live streams, I can write some checks here and there. And it's been very inspirational. And I kind of feel like, wow, this is it's almost like for those of us who've done really well, like it's an obligation, frankly, as a member of society.
Yes. Let me ask you this, right? When Andrew Yang ran for president, I think now the numbers are quite clear. He's like a low millionaire, allegedly, right? And he would always say to me, he's like, hey, Muhan, just, again, people will portray me this way, but like, I am not as rich as people think I am. I'm like, cool, I appreciate you keeping it real that way. How much money do you need to run for president of the United States?
Oh.
Right? Oh, snap. One sec, Tom. I think I've frozen. Or are you frozen? More likely I've frozen. Common chat, private chat.
Fresh. I think we're back now.
Hey, we're back. Sorry about that, Tom. Was that on my side?
No, I don't know. It might be my kids playing video games upstairs. Who knows? They have no respect for the Nerds live stream bandwidth requirements.
Superstars on it, right?
It's like, come on, I got Muhan on here. So, yeah. What your question was like, how much do you need to run for president? Like, my view. I mean, there's two questions. There's like, how much do you need to raise for your campaign? But then how much do you personally need to have? Yeah. Yes. And the interesting thing is if you assume that, like, let's say, like you were saying, people in their 40s, they've accumulated a lot of life experience or whatever. they've also often accumulated responsibilities.
Of course.
Right. So they may have kids, they may have aging parents, they may have spouses, they may have sort of these obligations. And then there's the opportunity cost of not working at very lucrative jobs that are also often very rewarding.
Yeah.
And then there's like the probability of winning is not high.
Yep.
And then you got to like have all these people attack you and your family and your motivations. Like, why would a rational person do that unless they felt this deep sense of duty, or if they're a little nuts, sometimes maybe both. But yeah, I mean, I struggle with that one because when I look at our Congress and I'm like, wow, I'm not entirely sure these people would get a first round interview at, Bain or Goldman or something like that.
That is correct.
And they might even, they would not do well in the private sector in many cases.
Yes.
And yet they are basically writing the rules for our economy. So part of me is like, gosh darn it, like we need to upgrade the talent in this team.
Yes.
But it does require individuals to make kind of suboptimal decisions for themselves and their families.
Yes. Yes. And I will say this, there's so many ways that we can solve this, right? One of the things that I definitely think about, I'll just give you an example. Man, why should, now that we're in the post-COVID world, why are we going to have campaigns spend all that time driving between events when you can essentially eliminate 80% of it, call it 1/5 of your in-person events, just do clubhouse events that give you the same intimacy, give you the same ability to engage, but it makes the candidate's life much easier. Right? On the structural side, completely agree. There are ways that we can make it so it's not this much of a sacrifice. Agree.
Yeah.
On the competitive landscape side, I was in politics. I was a COO, again, of this subversive campaign. The fact that politics lost me is pretty bad if you think about it. Like, I've accumulated this insane experience that is probably really valuable. And yet, if you want to think about it from a market standpoint, the market of politics is just this very, very, very strange set of incentives. And it doesn't reward control. Like, anyone who builds a long-term career in politics ends up needing to start their own consultancy where they can get the work, they can build a team, but ultimately that's the only way that they can get health insurance. That's the only way that they can get recurring revenue. That's the only way that they can get some form of stability, right?
Yeah.
And so the last portion of that really animates me is no one has been able to answer that question for me. And you're correct. Like, it's an incredibly intimate, subjective question. So you look at someone like Yang, he's like, okay, Yang was successful. Did he have money? Of course. Did he have Michael Bloomberg money? Did he have Tom Steyer money? No. We got joked that he was the poor man's Tom Steyer, and Tom Steyer was the poor man's Michael Bloomberg, right? I am the poor man's Andrew Huangs. We are all poor man's someone else's something, right? And yet, the fact that he ran, do you believe not only one, that Andrew Yang sleeps very well at night knowing that he lived his values and that he's killing it? For sure. So, like, individually, yes, did he pay a high cost? Absolutely. But is he also the largest collector of that risk and reward? For sure. And then you also have the crazy benefits that society has, right? Like, we wouldn't be having this conversation if this guy in 2016 wasn't like, oh my gosh, the country is going a really dark way. And exactly to what you said, like, all of these uncompetitive incumbents couldn't even pass the first round interview at the places that we would work at.
Yeah.
And so the writing that I explore now, so the only place that I was able to get an answer to this question, by the way, turned out to be in my work as an angel investor. As an angel investor, I look at financials. I look at founders, in this case, I'm substituting for candidates, doing very ambitious things, right? And how they think about their cash flow to go do that. Now, do founders need to be wealthy? Of course, ideally the more is better. But as an organization, if I'm seeding you, I actually only look for 18 months of runway. If a company has more than 18 months of runway at funding, there's it's not a bad thing, but I wonder okay, are they, selling out too much of their equity too soon? Are they, primarily, are they too conservative? Will they be able to capture this market if they don't move more fast and more aggressive, right? Like 2021, just an example, like no one's going to start a profitable search engine at this point, right? Bing tried, and Bing is only like profitable because it ends up being a feeder service for the rest of Microsoft's products, right? And so there is this point where it's like, yes, you're right. As you move, the target moves. But even though this question is really intimate and it's subjective, there is this absence of defining it for the individual to say, at what point am I going to believe, at what point am I going to value my time at the price that these employers value me at? There was at one point later on in the org for a few months, right, where I made $130,000. That was insane money to me. But also I was totally liable, totally responsible. And it was only for like 3 months, right? Fine. And I remember this feeling being like, wow, I make 6 figures now at 26, running this campaign that I'm really proud of. For the most part, obviously very stressful, all these things. And I don't feel like that different of a person. I am just as mediocre as I was before. I still have my insecurities, still this young dude, still trying to figure it out. There are some things I've clearly gotten. I can read rules. I can like file paperwork with the FEC, but this is like not magic, right? And that exploration of the individual transformation is really what excites me about the transferability of what we do in startup investing. By the time that I went full-time on my own business, I probably reviewed maybe 100 to 150 companies and written deal memos about it. Now I'm probably a little bit higher. And really that mindset of like, wait a second, if I will give my capital to these founders to start these businesses, if they have 18 months of runway, I have like comfortably more than 18 months of runway. I'm not a super spendy guy. I have some savings from my work. And like, I'm not starting a really capital intensive business. Then why would I not feel that way about me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does.
When I talk about the learned helplessness, there's not a single university, hospital, insurance company. There's very few institutions in this country that are going to say like, hey, Tom, you are enough. No, you, Tom, had to be like, if Andrew Yang could do that, like, yes, I can throw together a website. Like, no one gave you permission to start your YouTube channel, build your following, and then ultimately become this like incredible distribution channel of ideas. Another reason I'm working in media, just on the side note, I was on the other side of the table and we were watching in real time once the Joe Rogan money started coming in. I don't think it's a stretch to say Joe Rogan made our campaign work. Yeah. So I was like, who has the real power here? I'm on the wrong side of the table here.
Yeah.
So I think that too.
Joe's definitely got some influence, that's for darn sure. I know we're at the little over with 1 hour mark, but before we wrap up, do you have a little bit of time to talk about Asian American?
I do. I just asked my friend to go a little bit later. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's just talk for maybe 10 minutes about the elephant in the room is there is reportedly a spike in anti-Asian American kind of hate and violence and discrimination. We obviously had the events in Georgia. What's your take on that?
Sure. So I've recorded a podcast with some friends yesterday where we dove into it. But to give you the overview of what my experience was. So maybe 3 to 4 weeks ago, I read a piece by a friend, young Asian American guy, also Chinese American by coincidence, who had his friends, maybe like early 30-something-year-old man in New York, Chinatown, get stabbed with an 8-inch knife. And I think that the immediacy of, whoa, this very easily could have been me, was like what finally, I'm embarrassed about it, but hey, working on it. Where I had friends like who peeped these things about Asian American hate crimes going on. And I read them, but I wasn't sure if they were real. And so finally I read this piece, watched this like 1 hour special, I think on ABC News and whatever have you, and then realized that it was a real thing. But even then, it didn't seem like the nation was there yet. It still felt like something that the Asian community was talking about, but it wasn't like taken seriously by the entire country. So I shouted out on my podcast with my co-host to say, like, I have a friend, wrote this piece, very real problem. Let's try and be aware of it. And then, of course, I think Wednesday was when the shootings happened. And suddenly, like, the entire country was trying to make sense of it. And I, even in the ongoing sense making that I'm making right now, it feels like the George Floyd for our community. I think that is the way I'm starting to see this, because again, for anyone who is Asian American, has friends who are Asian American, we've been talking about, there's been like these informal news of these things going on for a year. But this Atlanta shooting was the one that really put it onto the national scene in a way that I am, again, still myself making sense of. And so the trying to think where is that I want to go. So in terms of looking into the facts, the numbers I had seen was that the number of hate crimes against Asian Americans in 2020 went from 3 to 28. And what's extra meaningful about those numbers is that those are hate crimes that were acknowledged as hate crimes. Right. So like so much of the controversy now is like, wait, so what is a hate crime? So if you, again, right, with the controversy that happened in Atlanta, if you shoot up Asian massage parlors, can you meaningfully make the defense that you were a sex addict and you were trying to clean that up? Or is that really not convincing as an excuse, right? Is that coded language for you wanted to kill Asians, that's for killing Asians, right? And I think that national discussion of figuring out where we stand on that is one that's happening in real time. I listened to an episode by the New York Times, The Daily. They have a podcast, and the way that they named the title was "A Murderous Rampage in Atlanta." Isn't that interesting? That it doesn't at all say, "Oh, wait, Asians," right? It doesn't all say like hate crimes, right? And so the fact that we are in real time as a nation trying to fight about what this moment means is very much, I think, also the Asian community coming together and saying like, wait a second, we finally have gotten to this level where like the nation now recognizes this is unacceptable and we have to kind of make meaning in public.
Yeah, the the Atlanta thing is a really complex one. I think partly because it is it's not like he shot up people who were praying in a church. So there's this strange kind of nuance of like, oh, well, this was kind of like is the occupation of the victims, as noble as, whatever, someone that was, just walking their dog or something like that.
Right.
And then you have this issue of these are very low income people who I think generally occupy these jobs. And then it's kind of, you have the gender part. They're mostly women who are victims.
Exactly.
And so on the one hand, you're like, oh, I can see why there isn't more outrage. On the other hand, when you think about it further, you could argue like, well, this is a perfect example of not just racism, but sexism and fetishism and just like, it's sort of this microcosm of a lot of challenges. And then for this individual who committed these crimes to say like, well, they were a temptation for me, and I was trying to eliminate the temptation as I think he was very religious. So it's a very sort of combustible, but it's not a cut and dry. It's not like a Floyd, here's a video of a white man kneeling on a black man's neck.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. For 8 minutes.
Yeah. And so it's a law enforcement person killing a citizen. So that's, I wonder, like, how do you think the country will kind of process this going forward after the initial several days of kind of consternation? Do you think we go back to business as usual, or do you think this is the start of something?
I think the key dependent and the key variable, given my startup investing background and my political experience on Yang, is that it is going to be up to the hands of those who make it. And to break that down specifically, I do think that this is going to be a crucible moment for organizers among the Asian American community and how this moment gets translated into power. And if it does, right? And that doesn't mean that it will happen, but to give you more context of the conversations I'm having, maybe in the last month or 2 months before all of this have happened, someone had a very influential entrepreneur had come to me and said, Muhan, if you have $10 to $20 million to invest in Asian American entrepreneurs, how would you do that? And I said, this is a very provocative and strange question. Why are you asking me? And that ended up starting this really interesting discussion where, I am not a fund manager. I have not actually worked in venture capital. I'm an operator who knows what startups look like from the inside, but I haven't spent time on a PE side. But you want to know what happens when you go to oftentimes Asian American people who have worked in PE and the banking side, and you ask them, hey, what would you do with a $10 to $20 million AAPI fund? I mean, I'll ask you straight up, Tom, like, what do you think their response was?
If I had to guess, they would probably say, no, I'll just invest in whatever's going to give me the highest return, or
Yes. Some version of going to invest in whatever is the highest return. Some version of, are you sure AAPI entrepreneurs need investment? To, I think that's too niche of a topic, but to what stokes my fire is that this is the same complacency and incompetence and mediocrity I saw when I was fundraising for Yang. I've seen this story happen.
Right.
It's the same. The loser mindset is the loser mindset, right? There's some people in society who will accumulate resources and feel zero obligation to pay it back. And those people are not my addressable market. The people who are my addressable market are those who are like, ooh, I don't know how to meaningfully make change. So those are like the types of discussions I'm having. But I think one of the reasons this conversation, what we should do with API entrepreneurs, was interesting to me was because the people who want to who are interested in this problem first came to me because I'm one of the few individuals, not that pompous, but who can take a position on, yes, Asian American entrepreneurs are on the receiving side of institutional racism. Sure, so to run you through the stats, I was making this piece essentially. So how this conversation became was the genesis was, what would you do? We have this thing. We've asked these Asian Americans who've done these monies and they don't want to do it. And like you so much as like, you're not from the fund world, but you clearly articulate visions. That's all you do. And you worked on the Yang campaign. Would you put together a vision for us? So the stats came down to this. It's 6% of Americans are Asian American. We're about 12% of the professional workforce. So we're very, very well indexed, overrepresented in terms of our population to how much we represent the workforce. Then would you like to take a guess at how many of us become leaders? Leaders is defined in the most broad definition. It means any form of management role, SVP, VP, CFO, like this is not even just CEOs.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a guess. 13%?
Six. So we're 6% of the population, 12% of the professional workforce, and only 6% of executives. Would you like to take one more guess at a stat? How much capital do you think is deployed by Asian Americans, despite the fact that many of us work in finance?
Oh, I'm going to guess maybe less than 6%.
Very good. 1%. 1%. Goldman Sachs
probably put it all in property.
Goldman Sachs is 1/3 Asian.
Yeah.
But the amount of, and it's the amount of capital deployed. Because if you think about it, CEOs have bosses. Those CEOs are boards of directors. So if 99% of your board of directors is not people who look like you, is that going to represent a real gap in them seeing the leadership ability of you to be CEO? That checks out to me. That totally checks out to me. And so when you ask me this question, like, what do I think the moment of this meaning, meaning of this moment is? There we go. Thank you. I see that the community has a large amount of potential, right? We are our own racial group that has our own complex East, Southeast, South Asians, like very different religions, different cultures, different backgrounds, different histories. But in terms of, is there enough legitimate common grounds between different cultures, between different ethnicities in terms of how we think, whether it's intergenerationally, whether it's the fact that we come from very, very young countries, so we're very comfortable with uncertainty, whether it's the fact that between the top 5 Asian countries in the world, you have 40% of the population represented. So our brains are, or our lived experiences are oftentimes optimized for a certain type of scale, right? Like even me as an operator in Yang's campaign, I can criticize my own behavior because I know where those behaviors are rooted from. I was very good for making sure the campaign didn't die. I was too late in hiring more employees to scale us properly as we went further, right? And so that's something I'm criticizing my own performance, and I hope to improve in my career. But so this idea of like, for us to define what Asian American identity is, for us to meaningfully propose that, right? To meaningfully pitch and not just be on the receiving end of, oh, like other people need to listen to us, but to have more use and not just flattering you, but truly like more independent individuals who say, I'm going to own this brand. I'm going to be my own media company. I'm going to circumvent the gatekeepers and build my own audience and my following and do these things. There's not a lot of people who look like you and I doing what you and I are doing. The number one feedback I got when I published my essay about transitioning from politics to media was from Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, and immigrants, non-Asian immigrants, who said, it's very clear writing your essay that you are our community. Like, you talk about numbers very clearly. You don't beat around the bush. You say things very plainly as they are. Can you please write more about your racial experience? And I was like, really? You want me to write more about my racial experience? So I don't want to be the race guy. I don't have any intention of being the race guy. But does it inform the way that I build and I create and I invest? Of course it does. It's woven into my very fundamentals. I'll just give you one more example on this. I love this. Morning Brew is a newsletter, business newsletter. Investment from Axel Spring, a valuation of $75 million. The story of that company is amazing. 3 kids from Michigan, 22, come out of college, raise money, start a newsletter company, and essentially, right, go from $0 in evaluation to $75 million in 5 to 6 years. Great story. Would you like to guess how much money they raised to start that business?
50,000.
750,000. 750,000 from 15 friends and family, Tom. That is what the resources they were playing with were. Now, are there people with more money who do a lot less with that money? Of course. At 22, that was not any reality that I had, that I could go raise $750,000 from my friends and family, because the only thing I was concerned about was not losing my friends and family money. And so those mindsets and those cultural experiences, when I wrote about them, I wasn't even explicitly writing about this, but that members of the community and 3 very distinct communities, right? Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, and immigrants read that, identified with that, even though they didn't have my exact experience. I think that is what this moment is. I think that's what this moment is setting the stage for.
It will definitely be very interesting to reconnect in a few months and look back and see if I hope you're right that this moment will be an inflection point. I worry that some other news story will take over and nothing will really change. I will say I'm optimistic that kind of coming back full circle, if Yang wins as mayor of New York and he does a great job, I think that will be a huge kind of step forward for the Asian American community, because as much as it's great to be over-indexed for professional jobs and doing well on standardized tests and all that stuff and the high income, I think for our community to really have a seat at the table, we need people in the rooms where it happens, right? And not in middle management, but in the board or in the mayor's office in the executive ranks. And so I'm excited about Yang's future. I agree, he's so young, and I hope we see more of them. I hope I guess if you're an Asian American person and you've been doing well in life, you don't have to quit your job and run for office, but lean in.
Yes.
Lean in.
Yes.
Yeah.
So many people misunderstand. I am a very extreme individual, right? I know my career is in many ways hyper unusual for someone of our community, but I'm not asking people to quit their job and become underwater basket weavers. It's not, that's not the ask. The ask is you have, the world is not that binary, right? You have resources, man. Even in my business now, in a very macro position, I'm hoping to get to 1,000 subscribers. And what I think that those 1,000 subscribers will represent is very well-heeled young professionals. That's disproportionately what my readership looks like. It's like 30s, 40s, some 50s, like a little bit more forward-leaning, who have income. They've worked for large corporations. That's how they amassed their wealth, right? They did not inherit it. And they do well in these jobs, and they invest in startup companies because they oftentimes wonder what it'd be like to start their own company. And so to me, it's like, okay, cool. If I can convince 1 to 5% of my readership to either start that business at all, or more likely, encourage them to start it faster, 3 to 5 years earlier than they would have. That to me is essentially 1 to 5% Andrew Huangs. And it doesn't have to be in politics. It is just doing something that they are truly aligned with, that they are excited about, that is also good for society, ideally, 1 to 5%. And then if the 95 to 99% don't do anything, but they just shut up and take their check out and just like write that check, that would be so much better than where we were 2017, 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And that compound effect of in the startup world, of course, higher standard investors funding higher standard founders, then creating all this insane amount of value for society. That to me is something that genuinely motivates me and moves me on a day-to-day. But in terms of like the broader spectrum, for sure, you can apply that to anything. Just like you said, you don't have to quit your job. And frankly, like you may not be that useful if you quit your job. But
Indeed.
there are all these ways that you can contribute and to take on that mantle of agency and say like, no, I have these resources. Yes, I've already learned. I've paid my dues, right? Like you, Tom, like, I've been told that I've gotten to a position of awareness and, fine, whatever. It was like precocious, whatever. But it's really like you read these experiences, you're like, wow, Alexander the Great was conquering how many empires at what age? At 19, right? Like this is not this is not like all these structures that are failing are artificial. And it's really the human that we have to rely on. That's why I have a job. That's why I believe you have this channel that is like incredible at distributing these ideas. That's why you're seeing all these influence go on, because who can you trust anymore but like single individuals who really like lay it out on the line? That's why Yang did well, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a dude who embodied all this symbols that he was selling you for. But like when we tried to just sell UBI, people did not buy it. The only reason people bought UBI was because they bought it to Andrew Yang. And so I want to find more of him and get those people doing their dreams and doing those things faster, better, quicker, and with more support networks. Because then that would be an immensely better environment for the future Yangs of the world, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does. And I hope it happens. And I think we're starting to see those wheels turn. It's a long time coming, but if more of us just do another 10% for the common good or pursue stuff that helps the community in whatever way we can, whether it's financial support or volunteering or, kind of making a run or starting a company.
Right.
Let's keep pushing and contributing. Let me wrap up by asking you, Muhan, are there any calls to action thing? Some people in the comments were saying, oh, how do we learn more about this guy? So here's your opportunity.
Thank you. For those of you who did not get, roll your eyes at me and my very stereotypical millennial job of begging for money from internet strangers, I have joked that I am a poor man's version of Andrew Yang, magical Asian man begging for money from the internet. You can follow me on Twitter, Muhan Zhang. My Instagram is Muhan Money, though I mostly just post pictures of food I make. I'm still figuring out the medium. But probably the best way to stay in touch, if you are interested by these ideas, if you're interested in how I tie my startup experience to how, frankly, that we affect change. A startup is a commercial vehicle for understanding and experimenting and ultimately enacting change in society. There are huge limitations to what it can do, but so much as like my startup experience totally prepped me and ultimately led to most of my success as COO. Please join me at muhanzhang.com. You can subscribe. The free subscription has 98% of my content for free. And if you are in the market where you're investing in startup companies, if you want to be in a group of other investors who are just distributed over 7 different time zones and really constructively, honestly talking about what causes companies to succeed or fail, then feel free to subscribe. I'm in our chat group. We work together all the time, and truly working with this group, Yang was an amazing job, but I can say with even more sincerity that this is the best job, primarily because I get to work with the best colleagues in the world. This is just it is a group of very aware people who want to stay honest while pursuing ethical wealth creation and capture. So would love to join. Would love to see anyone from our community join, but really appreciate the opportunity, Tom. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, man, it's been great. We covered quite a wide swath of topics, and I'm sure people will enjoy it on replay as well. But with that, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.